So that is kind of the main part we have for our our first analytical task. We're going to be talking more about what an analytical essay looks like when we talk about our external exam at the end of today's session. But for now, let's talk creative spoken. Now, this is a really interesting task. It's a bit of an oddball because it requires you for a bit of drama skills, a bit of video editing skills. These are things that you might not be too all familiar with, or perhaps not even all too comfortable with. But today I'm going to show you some of the most important information you're going to need to make this process sort of as painless as possible. On the other hand, some of you might jump at this chance. This might be the kind of assessment that you love. It's quite different from what you do at school, which can be exciting as well. So the key skill within this assignment is being able to take an idea from a base text, a poem, a novella, a short story, a novel even, a play, and to shift and change it to fit a new cultural context. So here are our criteria for the imaginative spoken or the creative spoken. You need subtle and complex creation of perspectives and representations of concepts, identities, times, and places in a reimagined text. So when they say subtle, they don't just want you to say, women deserve rights. Yes, they do, but why are you telling me this? Why are you saying it that blatantly, that bluntly? You need to come up with a more creative way of proving that point throughout your piece. The complex creation means that you're not just using one aesthetic feature to prove it, one stylistic device, one character to make this point. You need to be weaving multiple of those together to prove the same point. The second, discerning manipulation of the ways cultural assumptions, attitudes, values, and beliefs underpin texts, both the base text and your own original piece, to invite audiences to reinterpret the base text. There's that word discerning again, good judgment. Good judgment. Discerning use of aesthetic features and stylistic devices to prompt emotional and critical audience responses. So you are the author. You are the power that is the powers that be when it comes to this text, this original piece. So it's up to you to be using your aesthetic features and stylistic devices. And this is why reading outside of the set things from school, set text from school can be so useful, because you have a really good idea of the way that authors use their aesthetic features and stylistic devices to prompt emotional responses in readers. All right, discerning use of the patterns and conventions of the chosen genre and the role of the speaker, signer, or designer to engage audiences with a reimagined text and invite them to reinterpret the base text. So be really thinking clearly about the genre that you choose for your original story, and be thinking about who you are as the speaker, signer, or designer, and how you are going to take on the role of author, the powers that be, to create new interpretations of the text. Discerning selection and synthesis of subject matter to support perspectives in a reimagined text. So again, thinking about logic flow, thinking about the shape of a story, how you're manipulating emotion, mood, and tension to create certain responses. And then discerning organization and sequencing of subject matter to achieve particular purposes, including the discerning use of cohesive devices to develop and emphasize ideas and connect parts of the reimagined text. So the word develop is kind of quite important here. It's this idea that your key message to the audience, or the key emotional response you'd like them to have, sort of grows and changes throughout the story. We might have a basic understanding of it at the beginning, but you want to have a much fuller and holistic understanding by the end of it for the audience. And then finally, discerning language choices for particular purposes in a specific context, pretty straightforward. Discerning combination of a range of grammatically accurate and appropriate language structures to achieve particular purposes, and discerning use of spoken or signed and non-verbal features and complementary if appropriate. That means visual and auditory features as well, to achieve particular purposes. So this could include pronunciation, phrasing and pausing, audibility and clarity, volume, pace, silence, facial expressions, gestures, proximity, stance, movement graphics, still and moving images, design elements, music and sound effects, if appropriate. So there is a lot there, but again, this is the senior task. This is what makes it the most challenging. And this is where your teachers really want you to see you stepping up, thinking outside the box, being creative. So I encourage you to be thinking quite intentionally about all of those different things. When you're writing up a script, make it a sound script. Underline, italicize, bold certain words, leave plenty of gaps to emphasize big pauses, leave yourself little stage notes, be thinking about your facial expressions, all of these sorts of things. That is going to take a sort of mediocre piece and turning into something quite extraordinary, or something that we might consider to be quite high marking. All right. So let's talk about cultural context. We've mentioned it a few times already in the session today. We talked about it in the criteria of the previous assessment task, and is a massive piece of this as well. So let's take a moment to consider the world we're living in today here in Queensland. So what aspects of our lives influence the way that we act and interact with each other? So there are broad things and there are much more specific things. So you might say a broad thing might be how the country we know today, how Australia came into existence, this idea of being a penal colony, a British colony, some of the pain and anger that comes from colonization and all of those sorts of things, to the sports that we are good at. The Australian women's cricket team recently beat India, and that has had a big impact. The Australian men's cricket team is currently doing quite well against Pakistan in the test series, so that is also an element of that. Cricket is something we are quite good at, just as the way that everyone at the Olympics knows that Australia are the ones to beat in the swimming. To the climate we live in. So it's quite hot at the moment here in Queensland. I'm sure you guys are quite spread across the state, but I'm here in Brisbane. It's definitely quite warm, even though it's been storming for the past couple of days. There's no way that public pools would be $2 to get into this summer. I don't know if you guys know this, $2 to get into a public pool, make use of that, if our average temperature wasn't as high as it was. So if we lived in a place where the average temperature was, 22 degrees, then there's no way that the Queensland government would make public pools $2 to get into. People wouldn't do that. But because our temperature is nice and high, because public pools are in such demand, because we want people to be getting out and cooling down and having fun in the weather, then we have that cheap price. So what are some specific elements of our culture here in Queensland that influence us? So let's say 2 minutes to have a think about that, maybe jot some of them down. What are the specific elements of our culture here in Queensland? And you can think broadly as well, here in Australia, that influence the things that we do and who we are, the way we see the world, or even more specifically, your own cultural or ethnic background, what your culture is like within your suburb or within your city, and then we can, or within your school, within your class, within your family. What are the things that influence the way that we are? All right, a little less than a minute left. Keep jotting them down. If you'd like, you can pop them down in the Q&A live chat down below so others can see what you're thinking, what some of those elements of culture are. So hopefully that little 2-minute break will give you an idea or a greater sense of the fact that the culture we live in influences pretty much everything about the way that we live our lives. It is intrinsic to who we are. It influences the way that we talk, the words that we use, the people that we know, the shops that we like to go at, the holidays that we take, the public holidays that we have, the sports that we enjoy, the people that we like, the people that we dislike, and so on. So culture is really important aspect of writing a story because you need to be thinking about the way that it influences readers to respond. So what is cultural context? When you're taking this cultural context from your base text, I want you to be thinking broadly. I want you to be thinking about taking a key theme from that base text into your own original piece of work. So it could be family, youth, love, grief, anything like that. The detail and uniqueness of your story, what makes your piece original and new, will come from the way that you choose to transform it. So the first way that you might do this is by teleporting and moving that theme to a new country. So you could move from England to Australia, and that is called a change in geographic context. So although England and Australia do share some cultural ideas, we both love a pub, there are definitely some big differences in the way that we see the world. Even just thinking about weather. Think about what the weather is like in Queensland versus what the weather is like in London. It's very wet and grey over there, and it's almost pretty much perpetually sunny here in Queensland. So that changes the way that people are, the way that they see the world. So geography can make a huge difference. Another way you can do this is time travel, so putting your theme into a new time period. You could move from the 1800s into today to the 2020s, and this is referred to as a change in temporal context. Your new cultural context could even come in the form of changing the gender of your main character. The men experience life quite differently to the way women do, in the same way that a non-binary person experiences the world very differently to men and women. So changing the gender of your main protagonist can make a huge difference in the way that they interact with the theme and how they interact with other key elements of the story. So this is how you might go ahead and change the cultural context of your piece. It is really important that even though you are making quite a drastic change in your story, that you're still maintaining a strong connection to the base text. There needs to be a really clear retention of the key theme across the two pieces. And if you would like, you can also aim to include a few Easter eggs in your piece in the same way that Taylor Swift does in her music videos. Thank you very much. So that your teacher can identify those and see that you are still retaining a nice connection between the two. It's also demonstrating that you have a really solid understanding and knowledge of the base text as well, which is always a plus. This could be a certain setting that you use in your own piece, a nickname that the main character has, a motif that the author uses extensively in the original work. And you're encouraged to use those, I'm going to encourage you rather, to use those creatively, give them your own spin, think outside of the box. Now, you're probably going to hear me say thinking outside the box a lot in terms of the creative pieces. You might be thinking, okay, Maddie, that's great, that's fun to say, but how do I think outside the box? Again, this is where your creative writing prompts come in. If you would like a nice, easy way to be studying for literature when it comes to your creative work, to be using creative prompts. So you can go ahead and search for them online. There are so many out there. Spend 10 to 15 minutes working on one, and you'll begin to see creative ideas and inspiration everywhere, all around you. So definitely be working on that. All right. So for most students, this task is going to look like a monologue. It's going to look like a filmed monologue that might have extra auditory and visual effects within it. So you have a limited amount of time within this monologue. Often these tasks are somewhere between 6 to 9 minutes, and that isn't very long to get a really clear message to your audience while including all of the elements of a creative story. So I want you guys to be thinking about using the classic shape of creative storytelling. It's a pretty easy way to ensure that you're including all of the emotional tension elements that you need to be including in a story. And I think there needs to be an emphasis on beginning your conflict nice and early. It just means you have as much time as possible to engage that conflict, to develop that conflict, and to be using it to create your final message. It's important to remember that by their very nature, monologues are one-way conversations, so you'll need to be creative about what's prompted your main character to share this monologue and who the audience is, who they're actually talking to. They're not just talking to the air. Who are they discussing? So as you can see, this is the shape of a classic story. It begins with your exposition, then your conflict is introduced very, very early. You have your rising tension up to the emotional climax of the story. You have a falling tension and then your resolution at the end. Now, you'll note instead of Disney fairy tale beautiful romantic ending, I have written resolution. Resolution just means that there is some sort of emotional conclusion to the story. Cliffhangers, they're old, they're out of vogue, they're very 90s, no one likes them anymore. They're pretty exclusively overdone. Unless you have an incredible cliffhanger that has been approved by your teacher, I would encourage you to think instead about how you're going to resolve the story. Now, resolutions don't have to be happy. That's not the meaning or the definition of the word resolution. They just have to have a definitive conclusion to them. Important to note. All right, so when it comes to the actual multimodal aspects of the story, less is generally more. So some teachers will have rules about how often your face has to appear on screen, generally more often than not. I've had very specific criteria from teachers, both from students and from myself in the past. I had a student whose teacher said that their face has to be on screen 75% of the time. So there are all sorts out there, all sorts of criteria for that. While others simply will say that you need to include a number of sound effects here and there in order to elevate the emotional response to your story. It's important that whatever you add into your story in post-production aids the overall tone and mood of the piece in the sense that it works for you and not against you. You're not just putting in those elements for the sake of it because you've been told to. Again, we're in senior. Intentional. We need to be making discerning choices in order to elevate your piece. This means that generally an increase in volume of sound effects, for example, would indicate a rise in tension and so on. A really important note here, and I can say this from experience as someone who not only did several of these tasks in school, but is also studying communications at university, do not leave editing to the night before. It is a process that always takes longer than expected, and you don't want to leave anything to chance in terms of like exporting and importing and all of those sorts of things. Sometimes your computer can just fritz when it comes to that sort of thing, so you want to be really careful about how much, giving yourself plenty of time to do that. And definitely have multiple copies of things, have backups, and all of those sorts of things in order to ensure that nothing sort of goes wrong at the last minute. All right. And then when it comes to the actual acting, the performing of the piece, it's important to be really intentional in the same way that you're intentional when you're putting together your persuasive speeches in English. So you're thinking about tone, pause, emphasis, hand gestures, postures, and the like. Now, this is something that comes a little bit more naturally to some than it does for others. As you can see, I'm not sure if you can see in the camera, but I quite naturally talk with my hands. I'm already doing lots of gestures as I'm discussing things, but that's not the case for everyone. So I encourage you to be practicing in front of a mirror so you can identify the way that your face moves, the gestures that you have, your expressions, change in tone and pace and pause and all of those sorts of things to make sure that you are putting on basically a good performance. A memorized script when it comes to this is always best because it makes you feel genuine and believable. You're not always looking down in the camera and then missing that all-important eye contact throughout the piece. Now, you don't need to be a master of the dramatic arts. Being genuine, being believable is all that matters in this. And it's really, really important to avoid monotone when you are doing this piece. You're not just blurting out 6 to 8 minutes of content without taking a breath. That is boring, that is not engaging, that is not giving your story and your script a chance to shine. So be thinking, as again, like you do in persuasive, about change in tone, going up at certain parts, going down at certain parts, pause, and other things like that. So definitely be practicing for this. Don't just turn the camera on and expect it to be perfect first try. It might take a little bit of time to do so.